Uh, just sort of by way of background so that everybody's on the same page, the VALID Act is a bipartisan, which means Democrats and Republicans support it, bicameral, which means there's a House version and a Senate version, piece of legislation that grants formal authority to the FDA for oversight of laboratory developed tests. It was introduced by Congressman Larry Bucshon and Diana DeGette in the House, and Senators Richard Burr and Michael Bennet in the Senate. It does create a new product category called in vitro clinical test, or IVCT, and this is really what the entire bill is based on, this classification of new tests that would be, as I mentioned above, subject to oversight by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Under the VALID Act, all IVCTs would be subject to registration and listing. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but at the very basic level, you can expect that any laboratory developed test that you're running in your lab would at least at a minimum be subject to that registration and listing with the FDA. IVCTs would be subject to pre-market review by the FDA depending on risk classification, and we'll talk more about what those risk classifications are. The bill does allow for developers to apply for what's called a technology certification, which is eligible for non-high risk tests, and we'll get into a little bit more what that technology certification looks like and what the opportunities might be for your lab. But let's first talk a little bit about the risk classifications. So the entire bill is based on these three categories of risk for IVCTs. And the way that the bill frames risk is it's based on what would happen if an undetected or inaccurate result happens from a test being run. And so the three classifications, high risk, moderate risk, and low risk, determine what type of review your laboratory developed test needs to go through at the FDA. If it's high risk, this means that it presents a substantial likelihood of serious, irreversible harm or death to a patient or harm to public health. These types of tests, if they would be established as high risk by the FDA, would be subject to pre-market review, which is the highest level of scrutiny outlined in the legislation. Tests that are considered moderate risk. So this is actually a recently added category. This wasn't part of the original bill, but in the one of the last versions that we saw in the last couple of weeks added this classification for moderate risk. And it's a little bit complex, as you can see from the language on the slide, but it is the tests that are classified as moderate risks would be subject to an abbreviated pre-market review. So still going through pre-market review, but less onerous than pre-market review for high-risk tests. And to be a moderate risk test, there are sort of two different classifications that you could fall into. One is that it may have mitigating measures in place, but it can't actually be categorized as low risk. That's the first way that a test could be classified as moderate risk. Or you would have to meet all three of these criteria below, which would be causing only non-life-threatening injuries, reversible injury, or significant delay in necessary treatment, having no mitigating measures in place, and reasonable risk of adverse impact on patient or public health from an undetected inaccurate result. And just by reading through these, you can see these risk classifications are complicated. They're not necessarily easy to understand on face value about how a test might be categorized. And so there'll be a lot of back and forth in the regulatory process, further defining these classifications and hopefully making them easier to understand for labs as you all think about where your tests might fall. And then finally, a low risk test is any test that would cause minimal or immediately reversible harm in the event of an inaccurate test result. Or it could be rendered low risk through mitigating measures, which would be in place up front. Low risk tests are not subject to pre-market review. They would only be subject to that registration and listing that I mentioned previously.